The royal medical chamber of House Velsheri smelled of incense and grief. It was a wide, high-ceilinged room carved from pale moon crystal, the walls etched with the genealogical lineage of the Velsheri bloodline going back 11 centuries. Soft amber light filtered through hanging silk panels. At the center of the room, on a raised ceremonial bed draped in deep violet cloth, lay Leora, High Matriarch of House Velsheri, first Speaker of the Kathari Confederation, grandmother to 6, ruler of 3 inhabited moons. She was dying. The Kathari were a feline species, tall, graceful, covered in fine iridescent fur that shifted color with their emotional state. In health, Leora's coat had been a deep, shimmering copper. Now it had faded to a dull, ashen gray. Her breathing was shallow. Her ears, once always precisely angled toward whatever held her attention, lay flat and still. The royal physicians had done everything within their knowledge. 3 of the Confederation's finest healers stood near the wall, heads bowed, their fur pale with the particular color that meant we have failed and we know it. Leora's condition, a cascading neural collapse, rare, poorly understood, aggressive, had progressed faster than any model predicted. She had perhaps 6 hours. Her family lined the chamber walls. Children, grandchildren, political allies wearing mourning colors. They were silent in the way that rooms go silent when everyone has already said everything and is now simply waiting. The door opened. Darian walked in with a tool bag over one shoulder and grease on his hands. He had not meant to walk into the royal medical chamber. This required some explanation. Darian was a human mechanic, 3rd generation, the kind of man who had been taking engines apart since he was 8 years old and putting them back together since he was 9. He was 34, broad-shouldered, with calloused hands and a permanent faint squint from years of working in confined, poorly lit spaces. He had been contracted 3 weeks ago to service the Velsheri sovereign. The royal transport vessel docked in the palace hangar. As part of a Galactic Union cultural exchange program that paired human technical specialists with Kathari noble houses. He had been looking for the secondary coolant access corridor. The palace map on his datapad had glitched. He had opened what he believed was a maintenance hatch door. He had walked into the most sacred room in the Kathari royal palace during the final hours of a dying matriarch, surrounded by her entire grieving dynasty. For approximately 3 seconds, Darian stood in the doorway, and the entire room stared at him. His brain, running the available information, produced the following output. Wrong room. Sorry, he said. Wrong room. He turned to leave. Wait. The voice was thin, but it carried. Even now, even faded to gray, even at the edge, Leora's voice had the quality of someone who had spent 80 years being listened to. Darian stopped. He turned back slowly. Every set of Kathari eyes in the room was fixed on him with expressions that ranged from grief-dulled confusion to outright aristocratic offense. One younger male near the window, copper-furred, clearly high-ranking, clearly furious, had his hand on the ceremonial blade at his hip. Leora's eyes, however, were on Darian's hands. Come here, she said. Your matriarch, one of the physicians began. I said come here. No heat in it. Just wait. The weight of a woman who had given orders for 60 years and had stopped explaining them somewhere around year 15. Darian, operating on the instinct that had kept him employed across 4-star systems. When the person in charge speaks, you move, crossed the room. He stopped at the edge of the ceremonial bed. Up close, Leora was smaller than she'd looked from the doorway. Her fur had the texture of something very old and very tired. Her eyes, though golden, sharp, still entirely present, studied him with an intensity that made him feel like a component being assessed for load-bearing capacity. You're the human, she said. Yes, ma'am. The mechanic. Yes, ma'am. Give me your hands. The room reacted. A sharp collective intake of breath. The copper-furred male actually took a step forward. One of the grandchildren made a sound. Physical contact with the high matriarch from a non-family, non-bonded individual was. Darian did not know exactly what it was, but the room's reaction suggested it was somewhere between deeply improper and catastrophically forbidden. Darian looked at Leora. Leora looked at Darian. He held out his hands. They were mechanic's hands, wide, scarred, permanently stained at the knuckle creases with the kind of grease that never fully washed out. He was suddenly and acutely aware of how they looked in this room of pale crystal and ceremonial silk. Leora reached out and took them in both of hers. The room gasped. Her grip was weak, barely any pressure. But her fingers traced the contours of his palms with slow deliberation, following the calluses, the old scars, the particular roughness of someone who worked with their hands every day of their life. "These are working hands," she said quietly. "Yes, ma'am. You fix things." "I try to." She closed her eyes. For a moment her breathing steadied, just slightly, just a fraction, and the fur around her face shifted, the faintest hint of copper bleeding back into the gray at her temples. The copper-furred male, Lord Aaron, her eldest grandson, Darian would learn later, said sharply, "Physician, what is happening?" The lead physician had moved without anyone noticing to Leora's monitoring panel. She was staring at it. Her ears were fully upright. Her fur had gone from pale failure white to something closer to startled gold. "Her neural cascade is slowing," the physician said, in a voice that suggested she was having trouble trusting her own instruments. "The autonomic collapse rate has decreased by—" "This is not possible." "What's not possible?" Lord Aaron demanded. "Her system is stabilizing." The physician looked up. She looked at Darian. She looked at his hands, still held in Leora's. "The degeneration rate has dropped 40% in the last 90 seconds. The room went from grief silence to a completely different kind of silence. Darian looked down at Leora. Leora's eyes were still closed, but her breathing was evening out, slow and deep, in and out, like something coming back from a long distance. "Ma'am," he said softly. "What's happening?" "Warmth," she murmured, without opening her eyes. "Human warmth." Later, much later, after the physicians had run 17 separate diagnostics and argued in low, urgent voices for 3 hours, the lead physician, Dr. Sell, sat across from Darian in a small antechamber and tried to explain what she barely understood herself. "The Kathari neural cascade," she said, we believe it is related to an ancient biological mechanism, a stress response. When a Kathari elder enters a particular phase of systemic failure, the body reads low ambient warmth as environmental collapse. It accelerates the shutdown process. She paused. "We have always treated it with medications. Temperature-controlled chambers. Nothing has worked consistently. And now?" Darian asked. "Your species," Dr. Sell said, with the careful tone of someone choosing words around something that astonished her, "runs a core body temperature nearly 3 degrees higher than any Kathari. Higher than most sapient species in the Confederation." She folded her hands. When you held her hands, her body registered contact with something profoundly, consistently warm. A living warmth. Not ambient. Not mechanical. She paused again. "We think the ancient mechanism read it as kin, or safety. The presence of something alive and warm and not leaving." Darian thought about this. So she needed someone to hold her hand. Dr. Sell made a small, complicated expression. "In the most reductive possible framing, yes. And you have the highest resting body temperature of any individual currently in this palace." Dr. Sell looked at him steadily. "You are, biologically speaking, the warmest thing that has touched her in the entire duration of her illness." Lord Aaron found Darian in the corridor outside the chamber 2 hours later. He stood very straight, the way people stand when they're doing something that costs them something, and said, without preamble, "She is stable. The physicians believe the cascade has been interrupted." He paused. "Recovery is not guaranteed, but she is stable." "I'm glad," Darian said. Another pause. Aaron's fur cycled through several colors Darian couldn't read. "You are a mechanic." "Yes." "You came here to fix a ship." "Yes." "You walked into the wrong room." "I did. I'm sorry about that." "The map." "Do not apologize." Aaron's voice came out rougher than he'd intended, clearly. He reset. "You held her hands when she asked. You did not hesitate. You did not ask for permission or protocol, or—" He stopped. Most individuals would have hesitated. Darian considered this. "She asked," he said simply. "She was the person in charge of the room, and she asked me to do something, and it wasn't going to hurt anyone. So." Aaron looked at him for a long moment. "You will remain," Aaron said. It was framed as an order, but landed like a question. "As long as you are willing." The physicians wished to study the effect. "And my grandmother." Something moved across his expression, real and unguarded. "She asked if the mechanic would come back tomorrow." Darian thought about the Velsheri sovereign cooling in the hangar. The secondary coolant access could wait. Yeah, he said. I'll come back. 3 weeks later, Leora sat upright in bed for the first time in 2 months. Her fur, the physicians noted with expressions of scientific bewilderment and poorly concealed joy, was fully copper again. She was reading correspondence. Her ears were angled precisely toward the door. When it opened and Darian walked in, tool bag over one shoulder, grease on his hands, slightly lost looking as always because the palace map still hadn't been fixed, she looked up. "You're late," she said. "Sorry, ma'am." Got turned around near the east wing again. "I've asked Aaron to post a guard at the coolant corridor," she said, setting down her correspondence. "So you stop ending up in the wrong places." "I appreciate that." She held out her hands. He crossed the room, set down his bag, and sat in the chair that had appeared beside her bed sometime in the second week. No one had mentioned placing it there. It had simply arrived, and took her hands in his. Outside the moon crystal walls, her family moved through the palace halls in colors that had shifted, slowly and then all at once, from morning gray back to living copper. The matriarch breathed in. The warmth held.